time to do something that at least has some number of thumbs for it. NATO, the Next War in Europe. This is an old Victory Games game. There are no new Victory Games games, of course. It was on my mind, primarily because I started putting together up there, you see Hoff Gap, the Central Front series. Some guy has modified basically what I was thinking about doing, but done a much better job. Put all the units in place essentially for the two new maps that came out in the early 1990s for the Central Front series. The three original maps I have rules and have played combined. Anyway, this is the same subject matter. Warsaw Pact invasion of NATO. Mid-80s in this case. About the same strategic situation as Central Front after they revamped it in a Moves magazine. Maybe a little bit more research efforts here. The goal in this game was to provide, initially it was apparently to provide a beer and pretzels game. It's not quite that, although if SCS is beer and pretzels, this is. Thanks, Dean. But yes, this is, at about the same level. You got, I think, a few more counters, but not many, as an S&T magazine towards the end of the era. A nice, clean, single map, a fair amount of counters, but I don't think that huge. I don't know if we got a number here on them. I think it's more than 250, which would be kind of, yeah, we got about 390 counters. Sicily came out with an expanded counter sheet. Not quite that big, but it was the case that some of the magazine games had fairly large counter sheets. Other things, though, that you wouldn't see in a magazine game, fairly nice little player aids here with all of the reinforcements for 3 different scenarios. And the rule book's 35 pages long now. Not as dense as an S&T rule book, but still, you would probably have trouble getting that much rules in it. They went out of their way to make it kind of clear. Maybe a little too procedural for my taste, but I can cope with it. There may be a few little ambiguities. Unfortunately, for you especially, but also to some extent for me, this is a game I haven't played a whole lot in a long time. The expiration date on it kind of came about with the fall of the Soviet Union for me. I've played it a couple of times since then, but not very often. Not that it was... I think my interests have shifted away from 20th century anyhow. I have no idea where I'm going to categorize this. I used to call it Cold War. Now it feels almost like hypothetical. It shouldn't... The research, though, in these games was very good. A lot of knowledge existed about the current state of affairs of the two armies. Perhaps studied well enough to exceed the amount of information known, say, in a World War II campaign of the same size. All right. Anyway, why it's not a great deal for you, and maybe for me, is that, yes, I've read the rules, but I'm not intimately familiar with them. I can tell you straight up, though, for the most part, this is a pretty much standard war game. It's got a few little subsystems in it that, well, maybe not terribly innovative, but it's a little bit more than beer and pretzels here. And it does have an innovative concept of airspace that can cause some weird issues. I know some people really dislike it. I'm not too bothered by it. Okay, so what about your actual units? Your actual units are going to have 3 values on them in general. A lot of information on the counters, including a setup hex, which is the same throughout all the scenarios. a little bit on my history with this. I think nearly every time, maybe every time I've played it, I played the big scenario, the extended build-up, which doesn't really put more troops on the board initially, but it speeds up the reinforcement process. And in fact, some units will simply not come in because I'm going to play what may be for the very first time the strategic surprise scenario. My experience with the game has been that until the very last time I played it, maybe close to 15 years ago, it's got to be, it felt very unbalanced. And that may be just the extended buildup, but I felt like there was nothing I could do with NATO to prevent the Soviets from reaching their victory conditions. And the possibility of a massive counterattack to push them back over, it just seemed out of the question. The combination of chemical warfare, more units coming in early, etc., a lot of units. And in a sense, the Warsaw Pact is the most limited in this scenario, which is one reason why I'm kind of interested in seeing if this changes my impression. Anyway, what it comes down to is, well, NATO could always do a first strike with tactical nukes. The game has a role in it. You're the guy who throws the nukes, you roll a die. 50% of the time, you started a global thermonuclear war, and you're dead. And whatever's left is going to blame you. Your ideology has no chance of surviving, in the post-war world or whatever, assuming there's not a nuclear winter. And it doesn't really matter whether anybody gets blamed or not. But everybody loses, but in terms of game terms, you lose the worst loss that you possibly can. I believe NATO would go to tactical nukes if they were losing greatly. Anyway, I also don't believe that the Soviets would go to tactical nukes. And there's no reason in this game for them to do so in general. Because here's what happens when you use the tactical nukes. First of all, you get an initial advantage on it. And we'll see in the rules when we go to them. But then the next thing that happens is almost all the headquarters are gone, and nobody is able to maintain any kind of rate of advance, any kind of territorial gains from that point on. Basically, the guy who does the first strike does have some advantage. He might be able to knock out a good number of his opponent's nuclear capability. But for the most part, he's basically just destroying the command functionality of the armies. And that's going to prevent you, because this game does use headquarters quite significantly for supplies, etc. That's going to prevent you from making any kind of serious advances. Well, actually, the NATO alliance could push the Warsaw Pact troops back to the border. They're not going to get deep into East Germany, though, for example. All right. We got a couple of these charts and tables. I think the combat charts are the same for both players. Number of different weapons. Interception charts, which when movement is done based on the different airspace, you have a chance of causing some effects to it. The terrain effects chart, this is the only place where it exists, I believe. I don't think it's included on here. Some special features, the sequence of play, and then a few reminders. And each player has their own little chart. Okay. First thing you do in the turn, you look on the chart, you read what you got, and you get reinforcements. They're divided by different scenarios. The actual ground unit reinforcements are going to be over on your cards, on your order of battle cards. Now, reinforcements come in many different ways in this game, because this is some are forming, or units forming on the board, either reinforcement units forming on the board or the Reforger program, which is similar to the idea, where you ship the troops in and the equipment's already ready for them, rather than keeping everybody on a base with all the equipment. let's see. Just looking through, there's quite a bit here. You know, you get to declare nuclear warfare, for example. You get to detrain your units at this point. Okay, one key thing to look at here, though, is this offensive support player. The person whose turn it is gets to place these offensive support chits in supply, and they're going to provide combat advantages. After you do your air attacks of any kind that you're doing, you go on to a joint supply phase before you actually handle the combat to see if the units are in supply before combat. Both sides are going to be doing this, and then you handle the attacks themselves. And then the NATO player is going to have a similar big set of actions on the turn. Hey, you know, I was going to describe the counters, and I got lost on that. So, yeah, pretty similar NATO standard symbols. Unit command up here, starting hex, which, this is where we got confused before. So like reserve units will say RS in that number, reforgers will say RF. Some reserves are going to say RR or RD to indicate that they come on the map using transport. Some say airborne or naval. All right, let's look at some more on here. We got an attack strength over on the left, way over on the right. We got it not in the brackets. We've got a defense strength, and then in the middle, I believe, is the movement allowance. The other number here, the bracketed number, that's how many steps the unit has remaining. Most units are divisional size. For this Warsaw Pact units, they're all going to have pretty much 2 steps. NATO alliance, there are a decent number of 3-step divisions, and those have extra counters over here, which you have to fish out. Anything else exciting? It distinguishes between hard and soft units, which is kind of important, because in certain terrains, soft units get an advantage. All right. Headquarters have a provisional defense strength, which means they have a defense strength of 1 if they're not stacked with anything else. It's pretty standard for other games. Headquarters in general can't be destroyed, but there are ways to get rid of them, like nukes. Okay. 3 or more steps of combat units in a hex have a zone of control in the hex they occupy and in all the surrounding hexes. 2 steps of units have a zone of control over the hex they occupy and something called a zone of delay over the adjacent hexes. And any 1-step unit is going to have a zone of control in the hex it occupies. That sounds like you can move through units now. The supplies are going to be traced. So core supplies is to trace back to one of these spaces in the game. However, there are certain times when you have to trace supply through a valid headquarters. Warsaw Pact valid headquarters are the same formation, and this is one reason why the Warsaw Pact's easy to disrupt. Now, one thing that's kind of neat with the game, it's hard to tell from here, but every formation has its own kind of color coding. National formations have the base of the counter is color coded, but then also in here the actual unit is slightly different colorings. That can help a little bit. You also have the unit designation up on top. Now, yeah, we'll see that in a minute. There's a limitation to how far you can trace supply to a headquarters, I believe. Yeah, it's the activation range of the headquarters. So headquarters, they don't have a combat strength in the attack strength position. That's actually how many hexes away they can activate and supply units. Okay. And there's some out of supply markers here somewhere. A whole bunch of them, along with lots and lots of Soviet control markers and a few NATO ones. If a headquarters is out of supply itself, if it can't trace back to a primary supply source, it won't be able to supply anything else. Warsaw Pact headquarters have to be in supply in order to use the offensive support. Strangely, that doesn't seem to be a requirement for the NATO ones. I thought it was. If you're an unsupplied unit, you can only move by tactical road movement, which is your standard movement in the game. And your movement point allowance will be halved. You attack at half strength, but you defend at full strength. And you can't get on a train. If you're already on a train, you fall off of it as soon as you're out of supply. You can't trace through all sea, obviously, I guess. Mountains, which is this orangish stuff, unless it's got one of these little mountain pass markers on it. An enemy zone of any enemy zone, unless you have a friendly step there, and through blocked hex sides, and there's a few of them here. One thing about this map, maybe all Victory Point Games maps, you know, the hex grid is fairly visible, but some of the numbers are kind of hard to read. You can kind of see them when the camera focuses, but from any distance, I'm having real trouble, especially in the woods, etc. I think SPI had this issue too at times. There are exceptions to the supply rules, though. So, for example, at the beginning of the scenario, all the Warsaw Pact units are in supply for a certain number of turns. Marines are in supply the turn they land. At least the Soviet ones are. Okay. Unfortunately, movement, they take up a lot of space to explain it, and it's not very quick to absorb because it's done in this procedural fashion. So they tell you what you need to do to move, and then it starts to go into it, and it takes a while to get there. It's not a format that Victory Games used very much, and I'm trying to think if there's another game I can think of right off the bat. I know it surprises me every time I see it. Okay. And there you're just moving hex to hex, following our terrain effects chart, which gives the cost of different hexes. There might be notes about armor, etc., having some special cases in there. I'm not familiar with any right off the bat. For strategic road movement, you have to be in supply, and you're allowed to use double your movement allowance. And let's see, you're not going to be allowed, you can't be in an enemy zone, you can't go through interdictions. That's about it. You can't enter an enemy country. Yeah, well, you can only stay in your friendly countries. So that's not terribly useful except for repositioning and defense for NATO and for the initial getting to the border for the Warsaw Pact. There are different types of transport. There's rail transport, where you'll have a certain number of steps that you're allowed to transport at once, I believe. Each unit that you expend, the number of units is limited by the rail capacity. Yeah, it's by steps. To move by rail capacity, you're just going to be, the railroads are assumed to be everywhere on the board. And that's pretty much the truth in at least Germany. Now you're allowed to move up to 20 hexes, and you can never enter a zone, interdicted, mountain, or unfriendly hex, which again means the Warsaw Pact's not going to be riding trains through Germany here. Okay. Other types are the ferries. Air ferry, You can only do this with airborne or air mobile units. And you take off from friendly territory. It's got to be in your home countries, basically. And then you're allowed to fly to anywhere in friendly airspace. I think we should kind of define airspace here. Airspace is basically you could trace a supply line to it, which means, and this is really weird, it means that your ground units are defining your airspace. And you could say, okay, you know, with SAMs and stuff like that, I can kind of understand why you can't fly over enemy units. Maybe. It's a little weird. What it means is if there's gaps in the enemy line, and NATO is sure to have gaps early on, you can really fly to areas that it doesn't seem like you should be able to. There's no distance requirement on air ferry. Now, whenever you do one of these transports, not the rail, but airborne, sea ferry, amphibious, you're going to be dealing with this interception chart and compare the turn, the type of scenario, there's all three scenarios, and where you are. So this is actually, each player has their own chart for this. So this will be for the NATO player in NATO airspace or Warsaw Pact, and this is going to be Warsaw Pact in the two different types of airspace. If you're not in friendly airspace, you're in enemy airspace. Okay. It doesn't take any special resources to do an air ferry. You're assumed to have the kind of airplanes to transport those in the quantity that you need. The next type, though, airborne transport, this is your paratroopers. This can only be used on airborne units. And what it allows you to do is to move to any space in enemy airspace. You could use air ferry if you're using, friendly airspace. And for this, you need one of these air transport markers. I think that carries one step. Yeah. And because you're going to be going into enemy airspace, you're going to be rolling on a more dangerous interception table. Now, the interception table gives you a number, which is, if you get equal to or lower than that number on a six-sider, the step that you're checking for is just destroyed, along with any assets that are carrying it. All right. For sea ferry, this is kind of similar to the airborne air ferry and all that. Here, you're going to be tracing from a friendly controlled port. Now here it gets weird. To any other friendly controlled port in friendly airspace. Okay. But elsewhere, it kind of talks about you can move to coastal hexes or hexes bordering major and minor rivers. Well, it's because some of the ports are on the river. It's not a contradiction there. It sounds like it is when you're just reading the rules, but you can only go to a port that you've taken control of, I guess, at least. It's friendly controlled, not friendly territory, which means that the Soviets could grab Bremen and use that as a friendly controlled port to ship troops into. The next one's amphibious transport, which is the analog to the airborne transport. Here you're going to need boats, and you can only do this with Marines, Armored Marines, Marine headquarters. And again, this is going into a destination coastal hex, and you use friendly airspace if you're in friendly airspace, you use enemy airspace if you're not. So you're able to actually kind of invade with this one. Finally, there's helicopter transport, which doesn't really use the concept of airspace. You can only use airborne and air mobile units. You pick it up using a helicopter transport piece, and those will go into the used box when they're used, unless they're shot down or something. And you're allowed to move at 10 hexes. The only risk to that is flak, which is if you fly into an enemy zone of control, you take, on a die roll of 1, you'll lose the step in the helicopter. Combat. So the core of the combat is a simple odds-based table, which is going to cause damage to both sides in numbers. Those numbers are step losses. You have some ability to deny them as the defender. Well, I'm sorry. You have some ability to deny a retreat. You'll get R's on the table as well. Okay. I'm just making sure that you only roll one die because this looks so much like the War of the Ring type table. However, when I read procedure, unlike anywhere, unlike in an SPI game, it doesn't tell me everything that I do. I do believe it's a single die roll, though. The terrain effects chart is going to have modifiers. An attacker penalty for attacking through that terrain. Soft units, they can be doubled in their defensive factor in that area. And then if you completely surround an enemy unit, you get, I believe you get all your attacking units doubled. If you have a headquarters which uses offensive support successfully, all the supplied units of that particular headquarters are going to be doubled for their attack. If chemical warfare is used, you use a different table. What the hell's up with that? Yeah, well, that'll be spelled out here. Okay, so the way the offensive supports work, you place them at the beginning of a turn, and they travel with your headquarters until they're removed. If you remove them, they don't show up the next turn. There's a one-turn delay in getting them back on the table. So you kind of want to be careful as to making your choices of which units you want to give that advantage to. And then as long as they're in supply and not suppressed by air power, they'll be providing that doubling effect on combats. All right, let's look at chemical warfare here because I'm not really sure about this. Okay, the first turn chemical warfare is used. There's a little marker to indicate that turn. And NATO's going to get some victory points every turn from then on based on that. The Warsaw Pact player will have, he starts with a number of these points and could get more throughout the scenario. NATO operational tactical air points are each going to be halved, rounded up. And from then on, their air points will be halved for the rest of the game. And that's to indicate the difficulty of servicing planes while in chem gear. Every time the Soviet wishes to, he plays one of these chem markers in a battle, and that's going to cost him one of his points. And any attacks against that unit will be on a different column based on the turn you're talking about. So you get column shifts 4 to the right on the first turn of chemical warfare, going down to 2 columns to the right a couple of turns later. So the ground combat table sometimes gives retreat results to the defender. If it does that, the defender can choose not to retreat. So a 2R is not 2 steps in a retreat, it's 2 hex retreat. For each retreat that you wish to ignore, you take a step loss instead to the whole stack. And there's an advance after combat. The attackers can advance into vacated hexes immediately. A hard unit that advances after combat, these tend to be armor, without crossing a major river, can then exploit an additional hex. And there's limitations. It can't go into certain terrain, and it can't go into chemical warfare and interdiction. Okay. The effect of air power. You're going to have two different types of planes in the game, tactical and operational. Operational can take any missions. Tactical planes have a very limited schedule of missions that you can use them for. I believe these points come to you each turn and they're use them or lose them. Yeah. And they'll be coming according to a fixed schedule. The designers claim they ran all kinds of cool computer simulations to determine what kind of air points there would be at this point in the game at different periods of the invasion, and made it a fixed value. So some of the missions one is an airstrike. You use one or two air points, either type, and you target a hex. And what happens? You're going to be using this airstrike table. Points allocated with a modified die roll. Terrain, I believe, modifies the die roll. Although I'm not entirely sure. Entrained units add 1 to it. I think you get the defensive bonus, the attacker die roll penalty on it. In that. Support suppression. This is an attempt to get rid of the offensive support markers. Well, to flip them over. On their backside, they have a suppressed side. And you probably roll on something. You can only do this with operational points. You look on the airstrike table and you apply the results. As long as you get any result, you suppress the marker. You can also do road interdiction. This follows the road interdiction table. You roll a die based on the number of air points. I believe you're allowed to use tactical for this. Yep, either type. And this is going to put a plus marker, which is an additional movement points for anybody to move through that. Now, I believe that has an effect on retreat capability. I know it has, you can't advance through it. I think you might not be able to retreat through an interdicted hex either. Rail interdiction. Again, you allocate a number of air points. These have to be operational. And this will be a number of rail points that you follow this. There are a number of boxes that reduce the user's rail capacity. These are the entrained markers, by the way, if you've been wondering about them. All right, nuclear warfare. I gotta plug in. Oh. All right. So I gave you the gist of the nuke warfare. One person might lose right away by starting it. It gets rid of a bunch of stuff if the game continues. There's not going to be any more trains. You can't entrain anymore. All air attack points are out of the game. No unit can move by anything other than tactical road movement. All reinforcements that are A's, air transport, reforgers, or naval transport are permanently eliminated at this point. Road reinforcements take a 2-turn delay. Railroad reinforcements are going to come in 3 turns later as road reinforcements. And you'll notice that you have 2 types of nukes, mobile and fixed. You can use each one of those points each friendly nuclear strike phase. This is to say that like the transport points, these are reusable. These are little shits are your transport points, unless they somehow get destroyed. You're allowed to aim them at enemy units, except for cities in friendly territory. When you hit an enemy-occupied hex, only hexes adjacent to the friendly unit, adjacent to friendly units can be targeted during defensive. Okay. Offensive nuclear strike phases you can hit anywhere. These use 1 nuclear point each, and you can't use more than 2 against any given hex. You're going to be rolling on here to see the type of target you get. You want a star. If you get a star, you eliminate. I think you roll per step. Yeah, you roll per step in the hex. If you get a star for that step, you've destroyed it. More reasonably, and like I said, you want to hit the headquarters because this is about the only way to destroy headquarters. More reasonably, you might want to roll against fixed nuclear delivery points to wipe out the other guy's capability to fire, and even mobile ones. Use your first strike that way, reduce his own capability to do anything against you. On the first strike, you get +1 to all your die rolls on your first strike resolution. At the beginning of the game, one of your goals is to grab cities. They're going to be your victory points in the game. So there's rules on who controls a city, which is basically by occupying. However, major and key cities have a zone of control within the city itself. This is in effect until after you've entered the hex and put a control marker, at which point the zone of control is no longer in effect. What is the big effect of that? Well, it blocks supplies and airspace, and is actually a way that, large sections of the board can be denied in terms of tracing supply lines. Could cause some cutoffs. Switzerland's always neutral. You can't move anything through it. It's got to be a little bit of it down here. Austria starts out neutral, but they can be violated. NATO has to respect their neutrality until they're violated, but if the WP violates them, Austrian troops, and there's one at the beginning of the game, will, some more come in as reinforcements, whether they're violated or not, will come into play. Worse, once they're violated, some Italian troops can come into play. Worse for who? And that can cause an issue. Some countries will surrender. Denmark and Belgium, if they lose a key or major city or 2 minor cities to the WP in WP-friendly airspace. Those countries will surrender. And I believe all their units get removed from the map, and all their cities that aren't occupied by NATO units become WP controlled. NATO can regain them normally. The country will be considered enemy territory to everybody in terms of rail use and such now. We got another country here that surrenders, right? The Netherlands goes if 1 key, 2 major, or 1 major and 2 minor, or 3 minors become WP controlled during this simultaneously during a victory point stage. If the second of these 3 countries surrenders, NATO loses 1 tactical air point per turn. The victory of the game, well, generally it's by counting up cities. And Warsaw Pact gets 1 victory point for each minor city, 2 for each major, and 3 for each key. And I gotta remember which is which. Key is the red, major is blue. All key cities count as major cities for terrain effects chart. It kind of confuses me because the pink is the minor, the red looks kind of like the pink, and I want the blue to be the important ones. It ain't the case. NATO, Well, NATO gets 3 points for each Warsaw Pact minor city and 6 for each major city. Now, these are at the end of the game, both victory point sets. But you got tracks that you can keep track of where people are, so you can keep an eye on it. West Berlin. Okay, now here's where you really actually do need the track, and you kind of don't want to screw with it by using it to track victory points. NATO gets 1 victory point each game turn that they have a unit in West Berlin, starting with game turn 2 at the end of the turn. And they've got the multinational force there, 3 different countries. La, la, la. Hey, we haven't gone into stacking. I think it's by steps. Gotta find that. NATO gets 1 or 2 victory points on the game turn that Warsaw Pact uses chemical warfare. Well, how many? And 1 or 2 every turn thereafter. The amount is going to be defined in the scenario. If there's for every turn starting with turn 2, if Warsaw Pact hasn't taken any West German cities whatsoever, it's worth 5 bonus victory points for NATO. And if Czech or East German territorial units over here come on the board, and those happen due to an invasion, NATO gets a victory point for each one. All right, and yes, I'm not sure where it goes into how they come on the board, but let's take a look if I can find stacking somewhere. Well, it's got to be somewhere. No more than 6 steps can occupy a single hex. I thought it was 3. All right. No biggie there. I don't know how those units come in. I guess I'll find out later because it's not really worth paying too much attention to. Okay, on the first turn, there's this weird situation where nobody's allowed to actually enter the opponent's territory or neutral countries. There's no attacking, there's no zones of control. NATO can't run away from the border. They have to stay as close to the border as or closer as they start out. Because there's political reasons, their doctrine is not to give up a somewhat forward defense. West Berlin, nobody can move or leave or enter, move from or enter West Berlin. Units can't do anything until they've been activated. The scenario rules will tell us when something's activated. There's going to be refugees on turns 2, 3, and 4. NATO can't use strategic road movement. On game turn 2, every West German unit is going to count as a zone of delay. Hey, we don't know what these do. Again, not spelled out nicely in the rules. I think it's somewhere in the terrain effects chart or something. Here we go. Enemy zone. There's a movement point cost of 1 extra movement point to leave or enter an enemy zone. See the zone effect summary on this sheet, which is over here. Unfortunately not included in the regular rules. But I think we've covered most of them other than the movement point cost. Who knows? What about reinforcements? I'm looking to see conditional. This is where it's going to explain those Warsaw Pact units. If you enter East Germany, you get the East German territorials. If you enter Czechoslovakia, you get the Czechoslovakian ones. They cause the victory points. Okay, so the specifics of the scenario. I'm doing strategic surprise, which is basically the idea is NATO is caught completely off guard. But for the Warsaw Pact to do that, to manage it, they can't do much of a buildup, which is why their forces are so limited. Game turn 1, Warsaw Pact gets a movement phase with no strategic movement, no entraining, no special activities. On die roll 2, there's no penalties for airstrikes against NATO units. NATO is not allowed to do anything, if I recall correctly. NATO has no initial activation on game turn 2. Everything in West Germany is activated. Then, I'm sorry, all NATO combat units, but not headquarters. Then the headquarters get activated in turn 3, as well as Denmark. In game turn 6, the French get activated. NATO doesn't even get a turn on turn 1. It's 2 victory points per turn for chemical warfare, including the first. And the different scenarios have slightly different situations there. And you could tinker with this game some more, hey, what if France, was even more dicky than they are at this point in terms of being willing to be part of the defense. Certainly that kind of opportunity to play what ifs might be there, to tinker with these and say, okay, what if Poland is not, really part of the alliance anymore? But there isn't anything included in the game about it. Basically, the designer's feeling was Warsaw Pact would not attack ever if they didn't have all their eggs, lined up. And there's no point in trying to defend with NATO if you don't have all the forces, if there was some kind of defection there. I don't know how I feel about that, but I like there being more opportunities to explore than this provides. This gives you 3 base scenarios, but for whatever it's worth, it's not like I think I used many of them. I think I walked away saying, wow, the extended buildup is supposed to be the easiest one for NATO to stop the Warsaw Pact, and it doesn't feel like they can do it. Well, when I look at what comes in these other scenarios compared to the strategic surprise, I actually think this is the one where NATO can actually halt Warsaw Pact. The point requirements are very high on this one for the Warsaw Pact too. To get a marginal victory, we're going to play 15 game turns instead of 8. That lets NATO kind of get on the board. That's going to be breaking 50 victory points. If we look at some of these others, it's very low, in the 30s, as low as 16. And that's kind of, well, what's kind of interesting here is you can see the 8 game turn actually has a higher victory point requirement than the 15 game turn in the extended buildup, which is to say NATO should be able to counterattack and regain some territory by their projection. Neither of the other scenarios allow for that. I don't really feel, from my experience of the extended buildup, that was terribly valuable. I may have tried tactical surprise last time. I know whatever I did last time, I was shocked thinking, wow, I don't feel like I had to use nukes as NATO. So I want to try this one and see if it's, if Warsaw Pact has a harder time. They certainly have a bigger goal to hit. The game suggests, I should be doing this in the playthrough, hitting Denmark early because it's so weak and it takes some time for the territorial troops to come in. They don't come in until turn 4. Over here they come in on turn 3, and here as early as turn 2. So in this one, it's definitely more of an advantage to try and knock Denmark out of the war using some naval capacity. Remember, turn 2 I don't get to or turn 1 I don't get to play. I don't get to invade anything. It's not until turn 2 that I get to launch that attack. So these coming in turn 2 means I'm not going to take Denmark. It's going to have its troops in play. Anyway, let's send this up, and I hope I'm under whatever breaks them into 2